Chapter 18, Into the Unknown. On the evening of October 26th, I was presiding at a meeting of the government when an orderly came into the room and handed General Chatilov a Hughes telegram from General Kutupov. After he had read the message, General Chatilov handed it to me. General Kutupov reported that the enemy had penetrated our lines below Perekop and were now threatening to surround us. Therefore, he had been compelled to order a general retreat to our second line of fortifications. Neither the matter nor the manner of this message left room for doubt that we were on the brink of disaster. I pretended that I had to speak to General Kutupov on the telephone, delegated the chair to Ems Krivachine, and went into an adjoining room. General Chatilov followed me. It was as clear to him as it was to me that the troops were incapable of offering any further resistance. The army's stock of endurance was already overdrawn, and no fortifications could check the enemy any longer. Urgent measures were necessary if the army and the population were to be rescued. I sent for Admiral Kedrov, who was at the meeting in the other room, and in a few words I described the situation to him. An involuntary exclamation escaped the admiral. "My God, why did I accept this burden?" he cried. But he quickly regained his composure. He had tonnage at his command for 60,000 men. The additional coal and oil reserves had just arrived from Constantinople. This made it possible for us to increase out tonnage and bring the number of men we could embark up to 70 to 75,000. We had not the tonnage for a greater number than this. I ordered every vessel capable of putting out to sea to be utilized. I demanded the immediate return from Constantinople of every ship that could be mobilized. Finally, I had all the foreign trading vessels in the Crimean ports detained so that we could use their tonnage also. M. Krivokine, who had a presentiment that disaster was in the air, now came out of the council chamber. He was visibly moved. We strove to calm him and assured him that every possible measure had been taken in anticipation of disaster for. I begged him to reassure the other members of the government as much as he could. For myself, I decided to set out for the front and take stock of the situation. I left at 3 o'clock on October 21st and reached the front just as day was drawing in. General Abramov and his chief of staff entered my compartment at Simferopol. Since the command of the Crimean troops had been unified and put into General Kutupov's hands, the Second Army's general staff had been stationed in Simferopol. When I reached Jankoy, I at once received General Kutupov, who explained the general situation to me. Our troops had been forced to retreat to our last line of fortifications. General Kutupov still intended to attempt a counterattack the next morning and win back our lost lines, but he had very little faith in our chances of success. According to him, the spirit of the troops was broken. The best of the superior commanders were out of action, and it was impossible to count on success. I agreed with him absolutely. Nevertheless, I insisted that we must hold the lines at all costs so that we might at least gain the 5 or 6 days which were necessary for loading up the fuel, distributing the ships between the different ports, and embarking the interior organizations and the sick and wounded from the hospitals, etc. General Kutupov promised to do his utmost, but his answers made me realize that he despaired of the troops being able to hold the lines. The storm was approaching. Our fate was hanging by a thread. We had to strain every moral and intellectual force. The slightest irresolution, the most insignificant mistake, and all would be lost. The first essential was to keep order in Sebastopol. There were almost no troops stationed there. My escort, which had been on guard in the town, had been sent a few days previously to the Yalta section to settle with Comrade, Mokrohausov's Greens, who had been driven back into the mountains. I telegraphed for a company of pupils from the military school to be sent to Simferopol station to meet my train, and for the necessary number of extra carriages, so that the company could entrain for Sebastopol. At Simferopol, I received the deputy governor and explained the situation to him. I ordered General Abramov to take all the preliminary measures for the evacuation of the military and civil administrations in Simferopol, the officers and pupils of the military schools, the sick and wounded, the families of the officials, and anyone else to whom the arrival of the Bolshevists would be a special menace. All the preliminary measures were to be earned out secretly as far as was possible in order to avoid premature disturbances. I promised that the evacuation order should be sent the moment it was needed, and that a sufficient amount of rolling stock should be put at the disposal of the Simferopol authorities. At 9 o'clock on the morning of October 28th, I reached Sebastopol with an escort of pupils from the military schools. I went straight from the station to the palace. I summoned Krivachin, General Chatalov, and Admiral Kedrov and gave them their final instructions. I ordered that the public buildings which housed the postal and telegraphic services should be occupied by the troops, and that patrols should be stationed at the railway station and on the quays. I made final arrangements for the disposal of the tonnage. Ships capable of carrying 20,000 men were to go to Kerch, 13,000 to Feodosia, 10,000 to Yalta, 20,000 to Sebastopol, and 4,000 to Eupatoria. I gave instructions for the order of embarkation. First, the interior organizations were to go, then the sick and wounded, then supplies of provisions and the most valuable of the equipment. Thus, when the order was given, the embarkation could begin immediately. At 10 o'clock, I received the French High Commissioner, the Count de Mattel, and the representatives of the other foreign missions, Admiral McCully, Colonel Walsh, and Major Takahashi. I begged them all to interrogate the representatives of their governments at Constantinople on the question of assistance for us from foreign ships, for we would need it if it came to an evacuation and we were obliged to leave the Crimea. During the day, I invited representatives of the Russian and foreign press to call and explain the situation to them. The army, which was fighting not only for the honor and liberty of its own country, but for the common cause of culture and civilization throughout the world. The army, which had just stayed the bloody hand which the butchers of Moscow had raised against Europe, was now abandoned by everyone and at the end of its tether. A handful of heroes, half-naked, starving, and exhausted, was continuing to defend the last strip of native soil. Our resources were dwindling away, and every day it was possible that we would be driven into the sea. We would hold out until the bitter end, protecting those who had sought refuge behind our bayonets. I had taken the necessary measures for the evacuation of all those who would be threatened with murderous reprisals. I had the right to hope that the nations by whose side our army has fought for a common cause would not refuse hospitality to unfortunate refugees. The alarming news spread through the town with the speed of lightning. The telephone never ceased from ringing, nor people from calling at the palace to ask for information on the situation. Late at night, some news came through from the front that morning. Our units had begun a counteroffensive and had seized the positions they had abandoned the night before, but they had not been able to maintain them for long. They had fallen back onto their original position, hard-pressed by the enemy's larger forces. Our reserves had dwindled away. During the day, the Reds had brought up reinforcements and followed up their advantage. By the evening, they had wrestled the last line of fortifications from our troops. The situation had become critical. The hours still left to us for the completion of our preparations for the evacuation were numbered. The work was going forward rapidly. Coal was being loaded day and night. Gangs of non-combatants were formed, recruited from amongst the members of the administrative bodies, etc., to help the coal heavers. Provisions and water were being loaded on board with all speed. The transport ships were making for the ports which had been assigned to them. The general staff and the administrative bodies were working very hard, sorting out the archives and packing up the records. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the French cruiser Waldeck Rousseau arrived from Constantinople, escorted by a torpedo boat. Admiral Dumesnil, temporary commandant of the French Mediterranean Squadron, was on board. He and the Count de Martel called on me, and the admiral impressed me very favorably. He was a man of strong will and unshakable nobility of mind. Our interview lasted 2 hours. The conclusions we reached are summarized in the following letter, which the admiral sent me. It is dated October 29th, November 11th. Light Division, Rear Admiral No. 9 a.m. On board the Waldeck Rousseau, November 11th, 1920. Rear Admiral Dumesnil. Commandant of the Light Division. To His Excellency General Wrangel, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia. Dear General, I have the honor to communicate to Your Excellency a summary of our interview of today's date and to request you to endorse it so that I can be sure that it is correct before I submit it to the French government. Your Excellency regards the situation at the front as hopeless and sees no other solution than to evacuate the whole of the civil population desirous of fleeing from Bolshevist reprisals, together with the remnants of the White Army, wounded or able-bodied. You ask my help in accomplishing the evacuation, for it cannot be effected completely without the protection of the ships which are under my orders and the help of several French transports or tugs. Your Excellency considers that if France will not promise you transport and junction with the army on the Russo-Polish front, should she promise this, you are ready to continue the struggle on this theater of war with the evacuated troops. Your troops must cease to play a military role. You ask for help and assistance from the French government for them as well as for all the civil refugees. The provisions they are taking with them from the Crimea are sufficient for only 12 days, and nearly all the refugees are absolutely devoid of resources. The means which the Crimean government have at their disposal for meeting the expenses of the evacuation of the refugees, their maintenance, and then eventual settlement, include a fleet of warships and a fleet of mercantile marine. These are free from all financial burdens, and Your Excellency proposes that they should be handed over immediately to the French government as security. Yours very sincerely. Our troops were continuing to retreat, hard-pressed by the enemy. I issued the following orders. The troops were to break away from the enemy and march to the ports of embarkation. The 1st and 2nd Army Corps were to make for Upatona and Sebastopol, General Barbovich's cavalry troop for Yalta, General Fostikov's Kubanians for Feodosia, the Don troops, and the Terek Astrahan Brigade for Kerch. The heavy transport was to be abandoned, the infantry was to pack into the wagons, the cavalry was to cover its retreat. At the same time, I signed the order announcing to the population that we were about to leave our native land. Order from the Regent of South Russia and the Commander-in-Chief, Chief of the Russian Army. October 29, 1920. People of Russia. Alone in its struggle against the oppressor, the Russian army has been maintaining an unequal contest in its defense of the last strip of Russian territory on which law and truth hold sway. Conscious of my responsibility, I have tried to anticipate every possible contingency from the very beginning. I now order the evacuation and embarkation at the Crimean ports of all those who are following the Russian army on its road to Calvary, that is to say, the families of the soldiers, the officials of the civil administration and their families, and anyone else who would be in danger if they fell into the hands of the enemy. The army will cover the embarkation, knowing that the necessary ships for its own evacuation are ready and waiting in the ports according to a pre-arranged plan. I have done everything that human strength can do to fulfill my duty to the army and the population. We cannot foretell our future fate. We have no other territory than the Crimea. We have no money. Frankly, as always, I warn you all of what awaits you. May God grant us strength and wisdom to endure this period of Russian misery and to survive it. General Wrangel. Simultaneously, a government communiqué appeared. Whilst proceeding with the evacuation of those of the officers, officials, and their families who wished to leave the Crimea, the South Russian government considers it its duty to warn everybody of the severe ordeals which await those who are about to leave Russia. Owing to the lack of fuel, there will be severe overcrowding on the ships. The time spent on the sea and in the roadstead will necessarily be a long one. Furthermore, the future fate of the evacuated is quite uncertain, for up to the present, none of the foreign powers have promised to receive them. The South Russian government has no means of helping them, either during the journey or later on. All these considerations compel the government to advise all those who will not suffer directly from the violence of the enemy to remain in the Crimea. The order and the communique were telegraphed to all the towns so that the entire population might know their contents. Late on the evening of the 29th, the last sitting of the government took place under the presidency of M. Krivochain. On the morning of the 30th, the embarkation of the many departments of the civil and military administration was to begin. Mems Krivochain gave his final instructions and sailed for Constantinople on board the English cruiser Centaur. I urged him to speak to M. de France, the French High Commissioner at Constantinople, and to secure his help in case we should arrive in the Bosphorus. At the same time, I charged him to do all he could to organize help for the refugees who would arrive there, also to interest the Russian organizations in this work, and foreign institutions too. If possible, I was counting very largely on assistance from the American Red Cross. I finished my work late that night and went to bed, but I was soon awakened. The admiral of the fleet had sent Captain Machikov, his chief of staff, to me. Our wireless station had received a message from the Soviets. The Red Command proposed that I should surrender. They guaranteed the life and personal inviolability of every member of the High Command, as well as of all those who would lay down their arms. I ordered all the wireless stations to be closed down, except one where the officers were running the service. My order and the government's communique, which had been printed overnight, were posted up in the streets of Sebastopol on the morning of the 30th. The population was in the throes of violent agitation for the first few hours, but this soon subsided. The people felt that authority was still in the hands of strong men who had not lost their heads, whose actions were deliberate and based on a settled scheme. They felt that they could all count on the support of the representatives of authority, and that all confusion would be nipped in the bud. Several persons who were attempting to create disorder by anarchistic acts were immediately arrested, and one of them, a soldier from a mechanical detachment, was court-martialed and shot 2 hours later. The embarkation of the staffs from the hospitals and the numerous administrations was proceeding in perfect order. Long strings of wagons were winding along the streets, which were crowded with men carrying their possessions. The employees of the military authorities, followed by patrols which had been organized with the help of the pupils from the military schools and the soldiers of my escort, were scouring the streets. Seeing that order was maintained amongst the transport and supervising the embarkation, all those who wished to leave had to notify the general staff. The numbers were huge. Our calculations were exceeded by large numbers, and we realized that we had not nearly enough tonnage. It was not so cold now. The sea was dead calm, and Admiral Kedrov decided to use every ship and boat that would hold water, taking some in tow. In these difficult hours, when he was overwhelmed with intensive, feverish work, the Admiral displayed rare organizing ability and worked ceaselessly day and night, attending to everything himself and demanding the same amount of work from his subordinates. An enormous amount of work fell also to the general staff. They too were unable to snatch even a moment's rest. In the evening, a representative from the municipality came to see me. He begged me to take measures in good time to ensure the safety of the town, the factories by the harbor, and the artillery magazines after our departure. He offered to take charge of the supervisory work and to organize a service recruited from amongst the workmen. I willingly gave my consent and promised to distribute arms amongst the workmen in good time. This was done later. The Count de Martel and Admiral Dumsnil came to see me. The Count consented to take everyone who left the Crimea under the protection of France. The French government accepted the Russian tonnage as security for the money for the maintenance of the refugees. On October 31st, an exchange of official letters on the subject took place. October 31st, November 13th, 1920. At this moment, when circumstances compel me to leave the Crimea, I must consider if and how I can use my army on the territories which are still occupied by the Russian forces which have recognized my authority, whilst reserving to my troops their ultimate freedom of action for use when facilities have been granted for returning to our native land. I must take into account the fact that France was the only power to recognize the South Russian government and give it moral and material support. Therefore, I place my army, my navy, and all those who have followed me under the protection of France. I have issued an order to this effect to the different units of the military and mercantile fleet of Russia. I am sending you a copy of it with this letter. I regard these ships as securities for the payment of the expenses which France has already incurred or will in future incur in giving the help which our present circumstances make necessary. General P. Wrangel, Sebastopol, November 13, 1920. I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your letter of today, in which you inform me that circumstances compel you to leave the Crimea, and that you must consider if and how you can use your army on the territories which are still occupied by the Russian forces which have recognized your authority. Whilst you reserve to your troops their ultimate freedom of action for use after you are granted facilities for returning to your native land, you take into account the fact that France was the only power to recognize the South Russian government and give it moral and material support. Therefore, you now place your army, your navy, and all those who followed you under the protection of France. You have sent me a copy of the order to this effect, which you have issued to the different units of the military and mercantile Russian fleet. You add that you regard these ships as securities for the payment of the expenses which France has already incurred or will in future incur in giving the help which your present circumstances make necessary. Together with Admiral Dumasnil, Commandant of the French fleet at Sebastopol, I have the honor to inform you that, subject to subsequent confirmation, one, I accept your decision and the arrangements you suggest in the name of my government. Count de Martel Dumasnil, I decided to spend the night of the 31st at the Hotel Kist near the Tsarskaya Quay. The operative section of my general staff was there. I was preparing to leave the palace when I was told that the Revolutionary Committee of the town of Eupatoria wanted to speak to me on the telephone. I took up the receiver. The town is absolutely quiet. A newly formed Revolutionary Committee has taken over power. The troops and all the citizens who wish to go have been embarked. The ships have put out to sea, I was told. Do you know anything about the Red troops? I asked. Nothing at all. There are no troops whatsoever in our town, was the reply. Thank you for your information. Good luck, I said. Good luck, was the answer. Towards midnight, a fire broke out in the warehouses of the American Red Cross. The population attempted to pillage them, but a detachment of my escort arrived on the spot and quickly restored order. The night passed without any other untoward incident. Since the morning of October 31st, the echelons from Simferopol had been embarking in their turn. The wounded were loaded onto the transport ship Yalta, which had been transformed into a hospital ship. Emilian, the head of the health department, was supervising everything personally, although he was so ill that he could hardly stand. He was receiving the wounded as they arrived and organizing their disposal on the ship. The ships which had taken on board the administrative bodies from Sebastopol the evening before had put out to sea, loaded to the utmost of their capacity. Fortunately, the sea was perfectly calm. The transport ships intended for the units of the First Army were in the bay. On my orders, they were equipped with sentries from the different units. Our armies were continuing to retreat according to the orders they had received at 10 o'clock in the morning. The front was drawing near to Sarabuz. During the retreat, we scarcely came into contact with the enemy. Towards midday, I walked through the town with my aide-de-camp. The streets were almost deserted, and most of the shops were shut. Now and then, we met a straggling transport wagon or an isolated pedestrian hurrying towards the harbor. Everyone we met saluted me respectfully, as usual. I became more and more convinced that the embarkation would be accomplished smoothly and that everybody would get away in time. General Kutupov and his general staff arrived at twilight. The troops were retreating in perfect order. Those who wished to remain behind had been given full leave to do so, but only very few took advantage of this permission. General Kutupov calculated that the embarkation would be finished by about 10 o'clock in the morning. I ordered the troops to occupy the line of fortifications which had been used in 1855, too, in order to cover the embarkation. The admiral of the fleet was ordered to finish embarkation operations by midday on November 1st. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the ships were to make for the roadstead. At 10 o'clock on the morning of November 1st, I went the round of the ships in a motorboat, accompanied by the admiral of the fleet. The embarkation was nearly finished. There were only a few hundred men still on the quayside, waiting their turn. As our motorboat passed along, cheers rang out from the crowded ships and the quayside. Hats and handkerchiefs were waved. My heart contracted painfully, and a wave of compassion, pity, and love for all these men who were so dear to me filled my soul. The last outposts had retreated, and the pupils from the military schools were drawn up in the market square. A crowd of townspeople were waiting in front of the town hall. I saluted the pupils from the military school and thanked them for their magnificent services. I said, "The army, which has shed its blood in great torrents in fighting not only for the Russian cause, but for the whole world, is now leaving its native shores, abandoned by everybody. We are going into exile. We are not going as beggars with outstretched hands, but with our heads held high, conscious of having done our duty to the end. We have the right to claim help from those who owe their continued freedom and even their continued existence to us. We have sacrificed much for their cause." I gave the pupils from the military school the order to embark and made for my motorboat. There was a flutter of handkerchiefs in the crowd, and I saw that many people were weeping. A young girl came up to me. She was sobbing and pressing a handkerchief to her lips. "God bless you and keep you, Your Excellency," she said. "Thank you. Are you remaining here?" I asked. "Yes, I have a sick mother and I cannot abandon her," she replied. "God bless you too," I said. A group of municipal councilors approached. I was very much astonished to recognize some of them, especially as they were members of the opposition. "You have spoken the truth, Your Excellency," said one. "You can indeed leave here with your head held high, knowing that you have done your duty. Let me wish you a good journey." I shook hands and expressed my thanks. Admiral McCully, the chief of the American mission, came up to me with a spontaneous movement. He wrung my hand very heartily and said, "I have always been one of your admirers. Today I am more so than ever." The last of the sentries were embarked. At 20 minutes to 3, my motorboat left the quay and made for the cruiser General Kornilov, which was flying my flag. A tumult of cheers went up from the crowded ships. The General Kornilov weighed anchor. One by one, the ships put out to sea. Every vessel that was watertight left the shores of the Crimea. None were left in Sebastopol except a few useless tugs and old warships whose machinery was so damaged that they could not be used for transport. All the rest had been utilized. We cast anchor in Streletsky Bay and remained there until 2:30 at night, waiting until the last men in Streletsky Bay had been embarked and the last ships had put out to sea. At last, we weighed anchor and made for Yalta, which we reached at 9 o'clock on the morning of November 2nd. The embarkation was already finished here. The tonnage had been found adequate, and everyone who wanted to leave had been embarked. Everything was quiet in the town. The streets were almost deserted. I went on shore with the chief of staff of the fleet and made the round of the ships, chatting to the officers and soldiers. Our cavalry had kept the enemy in check, covering the infantry's retreat. Then they had broken right away from the enemy and reached Yalta by forced marches. They had left the Red troops a long way behind them. The enemy were not expected to arrive before the next day at the earliest. I returned to the cruiser General Kornilov. Towards midday, the transports began moving. The crowded ships passed before me. Cheers filled the air. The Russian spirit is great, and the Russian soul unfathomable. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we weighed anchor and made for Feodosia. Admiral Dumasnil was following us on board the cruiser Waldeck Rousseau, escorted by a torpedo boat. Shortly afterwards, we met the enormous transport ship the Don. We were greeted with shouts and cheers. Whilst we were still a long way off, we could make out the Papakas. General Fostikov and his Kubanians were on board the Don. I ordered one of our ship's boats to be launched, and went over to the transport ship. The embarkation had been less successful at Feodosia. According to General Vostokov, the tonnage had been insufficient, and one of the Kubanian divisions had not been able to embark. It had set out for Kerch. General Vostokov's report raised well-founded doubts as to the measures which he had taken. I returned to the cruiser General Kornilov and sent a wireless message to Kerch, directing General Abramov to wait for and embark the Kubanians at all costs. On November 3rd, at 9 o'clock in the morning, we anchored in the roadstead outside Feodosia. We received a wireless message from General Kubanian and Terek troops have arrived. The embarkation is proceeding smoothly. The Chief of Staff of the fleet left for Kerch on board the icebreaker Gaidamak, followed by the transport ship Rossiya, which had just arrived from Constantinople and could take a party of troops on board in addition to its ordinary passengers. The recent cold spell had broken. The weather was fine once again. It was even quite hot in the sun. The sea was as clear as a mirror and reflected the transparent blue sky. Groups of white seagulls were wheeling through the air, and the coast was enshrouded in a pink haze. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Waldeck Rousseau weighed anchor and fired a salute of 21 guns, the last salute to the Russian flag in Russian territorial waters. The General Kornilov replied to it. Shortly afterwards, we received a wireless message from the Chief of Staff of the fleet, who had gone to Kerch. Embarkation finished, everyone on board to the last soldier. At 20 minutes to 4, the Gaidamak reappeared. The embarkation had been carried out brilliantly. The troops which had been on barges had been transshipped to the Rossiya, and the ships had put out to sea. I felt an immense weight fall from my mind. For a few moments, my thoughts escaped quite involuntarily from the sad present and the uncertain future. God had helped me to do my duty. He would bless our journey into the unknown. I gave the order to make for Constantinople. The General Kornilov received a wireless message from the Waldeck Rousseau. To General Wrangel from Admiral Dumesnil. For the last 7 months, the officers and soldiers of the South Russian Army under your command have given a splendid display of gallantry. They have fought an enemy 10 times more numerous than themselves and have striven to free Russia from shameful tyranny. The struggle was too unequal, and you have been compelled to leave your country. I realize the anguish this step has cost you, but you must find some satisfaction in the knowledge that the evacuation has been conducted in an exemplary manner. The French fleet, which has given you its wholehearted support, rejoices to see the evacuation so brilliantly terminated. Your struggle has not been in vain. The population of South Russia will soon begin to compare your just and beneficent rule with the vile government of the Soviets. Thus, you will be instrumental in awakening and regenerating your country. I most sincerely hope that this awakening may come about as soon as possible. The Admiral, the officers, and the sailors of the French fleet do reverence to General Wrangel and pay homage to his valor. Soon afterwards, we intercepted another Soviet wireless message from Sebastopol to Moscow, urgently demanding that experienced propagandists be sent at once, because there were none left in the Crimea. A sinking testimonial to General Klimovich. Night is falling. The stars are gleaming in the darkening sky. The sea is all a twinkle. The lonely lights on my native shore glow fainter and then vanish altogether, one after the other. And now the last one fades from my sight. Farewell, my country. Seremsky Karlovy, December 30th, 1923. Part 3. The White Armies in Russia and Later.